Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The autumn rain pelts against the tall windows of the Appalachian Heritage Museum in Asheville, North Carolina, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the delicate work being performed inside. Senior photograph conservator Margaret Chin leans over the antique daguerreotype, her magnifying loupe revealing details invisible to the naked eye. The image before her, dated 1853, shows a prosperous family arranged on the porch of a substantial brick home nestled in the mountains. The Hannon family, according to the museum's acquisition records. 5 people frozen in time. A stern-faced patriarch in a fine wool suit, his wife in an elaborate silk dress with intricate lace collar, 2 young children in pristine clothing, and standing slightly apart, an elderly woman whose face holds an expression Margaret cannot quite decipher. The photograph came to the museum 3 weeks ago as part of an estate donation from the descendants of the Hannon family. Eleanor Hannon Pierce, an elderly woman from Charleston, had sent 17 boxes of family documents, photographs, and personal effects, stipulating only that the museum preserve and display the materials to tell the story of early Appalachian prosperity. The photograph in question was designated as the centerpiece of the upcoming exhibition titled Mountain Fortunes: Success Stories from the Appalachian Frontier. Margaret's job is to restore the image, stabilize the deteriorating case, and prepare it for display. What she discovers instead will unravel everything the museum believes about this seemingly admirable family. Margaret notices something peculiar about the photograph's ornate frame. Unlike typical daguerreotype cases of the period, this one appears to have been modified. There are minute scratches along the inner edge, as if someone had pried it open and resealed it. She calls over her colleague, David Armstrong, a materials analyst who specializes in 19th century photography. Together, they carefully separate the frame's components using specialized tools, their movements precise and methodical. Beneath the primary image, they find something unexpected: a second, smaller photograph, deliberately concealed. This hidden daguerreotype shows a young black child, perhaps 7 years old, standing alone against a plain backdrop. The child's eyes stare directly at the camera with a haunting intensity that makes Margaret's breath catch in her throat. David photographs the discovery with the museum's high-resolution camera while Margaret examines the hidden image more closely. On the back of the concealed daguerreotype, someone has scratched words into the metal plate with what appears to be a sharp instrument. The handwriting is crude, the letters uneven, suggesting someone with limited literacy or working in difficult conditions. Margaret transcribes the words carefully. Samuel. Sold to Dawson. June 1853. God forgive us. The revelation hangs in the air between the 2 conservators like a physical presence. Margaret feels her stomach tighten as the implication becomes clear. This prosperous family's wealth, the fine house, the expensive clothing, the very photograph meant to celebrate their success, all of it potentially financed by the sale of a child. The museum's director, Dr. Robert Callahan, arrives within the hour after Margaret's urgent call. He studies both photographs through the magnifying glass, his face growing increasingly pale. The upcoming exhibition is scheduled to open in 6 weeks. Major donors have already been invited. The museum's board has approved significant funding based on the premise of celebrating Appalachian entrepreneurship. Now they face a devastating moral and historical revelation that could transform the entire narrative. Dr. Callahan makes a decision that will set into motion a chain of events none of them can fully anticipate. Instead of proceeding with the planned exhibition, he authorizes a complete historical investigation into the Hannon family. Margaret and David will lead the research, assisted by the museum's chief historian, Dr. Patricia Morrison, and a team of graduate students from the nearby university. The investigation begins in the museum's archive room, where the 17 boxes from Eleanor Hannon Pierce wait to be fully cataloged. Margaret, David, and Patricia work systematically through the materials, photographing and documenting everything. They find ledgers detailing business transactions, personal correspondence dating back to the 1830s, deeds to various properties, and dozens of additional photographs. One letter, dated May 1853, catches Patricia's attention. Written by Thomas Hannon to his brother in Richmond, Virginia, it discusses financial difficulties following a failed mining venture and mentions the necessity of liquidating certain assets to preserve the family's standing. The euphemistic language cannot disguise what Patricia suspects is a reference to the sale of enslaved people. As evening approaches and shadows lengthen across the archive room, the team uncovers a leather-bound journal belonging to Martha Hannon, the matriarch in the photograph. The journal entries span from 1845 to 1860, providing an intimate window into the family's daily life. Martha writes about household management, social obligations, her children's education, and her husband's business dealings. Her handwriting is elegant, her observations often perceptive, but there are conspicuous gaps in the narrative. Entire months go unrecorded. When she resumes writing after these silences, her tone has changed, becoming more reserved, more careful. Patricia notes these patterns, recognizing them as potential indicators of traumatic events the writer chose not to document directly. The team works late into the night, driven by a combination of professional responsibility and growing personal investment in uncovering the truth. They order dinner from a nearby restaurant and eat at the archive table, surrounded by the material remnants of lives lived more than a century and a half ago. David discovers a series of business receipts from 1853, including one from a slave trading firm in Knoxville called Dawson and Associates. The receipt is for $500, an enormous sum at the time, described as payment for one Negro boy, age approximately 7 years, healthy and compliant. The cold, transactional language makes Margaret feel physically ill. She thinks about her own 7-year-old nephew, imagining him torn from his family and sold like livestock to by midnight. They have constructed a preliminary timeline of the Hannon family's financial history. Thomas Hannon arrived in western North Carolina in 1838 with modest capital and ambitious plans. He invested in mining operations, attempting to capitalize on the region's gold deposits. For nearly 15 years, the ventures produced inconsistent returns. The family maintained appearances but struggled privately with debt. Then, in June 1853, there is a sudden influx of capital. The timing corresponds exactly with the sale documented in the hidden photograph and the Dawson and Associates receipt. Within months of this transaction, Thomas Hannon purchased the brick house shown in the family photograph, expanded his mining operations, and began investing in other local businesses. The prosperity depicted in that formal family portrait, meant to project success and respectability, was built on an act of profound moral violence. Margaret cannot sleep when she finally returns to her apartment in the early morning hours. She lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the hidden photograph of Samuel. Who was he? Where did he come from? What happened to him after he was sold? Did he have parents who grieved for him? Siblings who remembered him? The questions multiply in her mind, each one leading to others. She realizes that uncovering the truth about the Hannon family's wealth is only the beginning. The real challenge will be recovering Samuel's story, giving voice and humanity to a child whose existence was erased from the family's public narrative, hidden away like a shameful secret behind a carefully constructed image of prosperity. The next morning brings unexpected developments. Dr. Callahan has contacted several scholars who specialize in the history of slavery in Appalachia, a topic often overlooked in broader discussions of the institution. Dr. James Baldwin, a professor of African American history at the University of North Carolina, arrives at the museum before noon. He examines the photographs and documents with the careful attention of someone who has spent decades studying the material traces of lives deliberately obscured by historical record. He explains to the team that slavery in the mountain regions of the South operated differently from the plantation systems of the lowlands. Enslaved people in Appalachia often worked in mining operations, as domestic servants, or in small-scale agricultural settings. The numbers were smaller, but the institution was no less brutal or dehumanizing. Dr. Baldwin suggests several avenues for research. First, they should examine county records from the period, including tax assessments that listed enslaved people as property, court documents that might reference the Hannon family, and any surviving records from the Dawson and Associates slave trading firm. Second, They should search for any surviving oral histories or family narratives from the African American community in the region. Third, they should attempt to trace property deeds and sales records that might indicate where Samuel was taken after being sold. The work will be painstaking and may ultimately prove inconclusive, but Dr. Baldwin emphasizes the ethical imperative of making the effort. Samuel deserves to be more than a hidden photograph and a scratched inscription on metal. Patricia Morrison volunteers to travel to the county courthouse in Marshall, North Carolina, where records from the 1850s are archived. She drives through winding mountain roads, the autumn foliage brilliant against the gray sky, thinking about the layers of history embedded in this landscape. The mountains witnessed so much suffering that was never officially recorded, never commemorated, deliberately forgotten. At the courthouse, a helpful clerk directs her to the basement archive, a climate-controlled room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of bound volumes and document boxes. Patricia requests the tax assessment records for 1840 through 1860, the period spanning the Hannon family's residence in the county. The tax records reveal a troubling pattern. Thomas Hannon's assessments from 1840 through 1852 list no enslaved people as property. This suggests that the family either did not own enslaved individuals during those years or concealed such ownership to avoid taxation. However, the 1853 assessment shows a dramatic change. Thomas Hannon is listed as owning 3 enslaved people, a woman aged approximately 45, a young man aged approximately 16, and a child aged approximately 7. The entries provide no names, only ages, gender, and assessed monetary value. The child is valued at $500, matching exactly the amount on the Dawson and Associates receipt. But this creates a puzzling contradiction. If Thomas sold Samuel to Dawson for $500 in June 1853, why would the child still appear on his tax assessment for that year? Patricia photographs the relevant pages and continues searching through other record types. She finds a probate inventory from 1868 following Thomas Hannon's death. The document lists his assets, including real estate, mining equipment, business interests, and personal property. Under the category of formerly enslaved people who remained with the family after emancipation, she finds 3 names. Miriam, age approximately 60, described as a domestic servant; Joshua, age approximately 31, described as a mining laborer; and Ruth, age approximately 65, described as a cook. The dates align with the enslaved people listed in the 1853 tax record, suggesting these individuals remained with the Hannon family through the Civil War and chose or were compelled to stay afterward. But there is no mention of Samuel. His absence from the post-war record confirms that he was indeed sold and separated from the others. While Patricia works at the courthouse, Margaret and David focus on the hidden photograph itself. Using advanced imaging technology, they analyze every detail of the small daguerreotype. The backdrop behind Samuel is plain, likely a temporary studio setup. His clothing is simple but clean, suggesting someone made an effort to present him as a valuable commodity. What strikes Margaret most powerfully is the child's expression. Unlike many photographs of enslaved people, which show subjects with carefully neutral faces, Samuel's eyes convey something that reads as defiance, or perhaps a desperate attempt to communicate across time. Margaret has worked with thousands of historical photographs, but she has never encountered an image that affects her so viscerally. David's analysis of the photographic materials provides additional information. The daguerreotype of Samuel was created by a different photographer than the family portrait, suggesting it was taken specifically for the purpose of sale. Slave traders often commissioned photographs of enslaved people to show to potential buyers, creating a visual catalog of human merchandise. The thought makes David feel complicit somehow, as though by studying this image he is participating in the original violence of its creation. He discusses these feelings with Margaret, who shares his discomfort. They agree that their responsibility is not to shy away from the difficult truth but to ensure that Samuel's story is told with dignity and historical accuracy. Dr. Baldwin returns to the museum with a colleague, Dr. Sarah Washington, who specializes in genealogical research related to African American families in the South. Dr. Washington explains the challenges they face. Records of enslaved people were intentionally sparse. Names were often changed when individuals were sold. Family connections were severed both literally and documentarily. However, she has had success in previous cases by combining multiple research strategies, examining church records, searching newspaper advertisements for runaway enslaved people or sales notices, reviewing plantation journals and correspondence, and consulting the collections of formerly enslaved people's narratives compiled after the Civil War. She offers to assist the museum's investigation, motivated by the same ethical commitment that drives Dr. Baldwin's work. The team expands their search to contemporary newspapers from the region. At the State Archives in Raleigh, Margaret discovers something significant. The Asheville Messenger, a weekly newspaper from the period, contains an advertisement dated May 28, 1853. The notice reads, "For sale, Negro boy, age 7 years, suitable for house service or field work. Healthy and obedient. Inquire at Hannon Residence, Bear Creek Road." The casual brutality of the language, the reduction of a child to livestock, strikes Margaret with renewed force each time she encounters it. She photographs the newspaper page and adds it to the growing file of documentation. As the research progresses, the team begins to piece together a more complex picture of the Hannon family's circumstances in the years leading up to Samuel's sale. Thomas Hannon's mining ventures had indeed failed, leaving him deeply in debt to investors in Richmond and Charleston. His social position in the community depended on maintaining an appearance of prosperity that no longer matched his financial reality. The pressure to preserve status, to protect his children's future, to avoid the shame of bankruptcy, created a moral crisis that he resolved through the most horrific means available to him. He chose to sell a child to save his reputation, but critical questions remain unanswered. Where did Samuel come from? The tax records suggest he was part of the Hannon household in 1853, but there is no record of his presence before that year. Was he born into enslavement in the Hannon household? Was he purchased shortly before being sold again? And crucially, who inscribed those desperate words on the back of his photograph? Samuel. Sold to Dawson. June 1853. God forgive us? The handwriting does not match any of the samples they have from Thomas or Martha Hannon. Someone else, someone with access to the photograph and deep emotional investment in preserving Samuel's memory, created that secret memorial. Patricia develops a theory. The elderly woman in the family photograph, standing slightly apart from the others, might be Ruth, the cook listed in the post-war probate record. Her age would be approximately right. Her positioning in the photograph, not quite integrated into the family group, suggests her status as an enslaved person rather than a family member. If Ruth was in the household in 1853, she would have witnessed Samuel's sale. She might have cared for him, perhaps even been related to him. The thought that she might have been his grandmother, forced to watch as the child was torn away, adds another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. The team decides they need to find more information about Ruth. They return to the county courthouse records, searching for any mention of her after Thomas Hannon's death in 1868. Patricia discovers a small notation in the 1870 census. Ruth, listed as a black woman aged approximately 67, appears as a resident in a boarding house for formerly enslaved people in Asheville. The boarding house was run by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of several institutions established to support the transition from slavery to freedom. Patricia feels a surge of hope. If Ruth lived in Asheville after leaving the Hannon household, there might be church records, interviews, or other documentation that preserves her voice. The African Methodist Episcopal Church in Asheville has occupied the same corner lot since 1866, though the current building dates from the 1920s after the original structure burned down. The church's basement houses an extensive archive of historical materials, lovingly preserved by generations of congregants who understood the importance of documenting their community's story. Pastor Michael Thompson welcomes the museum team warmly, explaining that he has been working with local historians to digitize the church's records. He is deeply moved when Patricia explains the purpose of their visit, recognizing immediately the significance of recovering Ruth's story and, through her, Samuel's. The archive contains several treasures. First, a ledger from the boarding house that operated from 1868 to 1892. Ruth appears in the records consistently from 1870 to 1886, paying modest monthly rent and listed as employed in various domestic service positions. Second, a collection of oral histories recorded in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project. Elderly African Americans who had experienced slavery were interviewed and their testimonies transcribed. Among these precious documents, they find an interview with Ruth Johnson, conducted in 1937 when she was approximately 94 years old. Margaret's hands tremble as she reads Ruth's testimony. The interviewer, a young black woman named Dorothy Mills, had asked Ruth to describe her experiences during slavery. Ruth's voice, preserved in Dorothy's careful transcription, speaks across the decades with stunning clarity and power. She describes being sold as a teenager from a plantation in South Carolina to a family in the North Carolina mountains. She talks about the isolation of mountain life, the backbreaking work, the constant fear. And then, she speaks about Samuel. According to Ruth's testimony, Samuel was her grandson, the child of her daughter Miriam. Miriam had been violated by an overseer on a neighboring property, becoming pregnant at age 15. She gave birth to Samuel in the Hannon household, where Ruth was able to care for both her daughter and the infant. For 7 years, despite the brutal circumstances of their enslavement, Ruth nurtured Samuel, teaching him to recognize plants in the forest, to find joy in small moments, to maintain hope. She describes him as bright and curious, with a quick smile and a talent for memorizing songs. Reading these details, Margaret can hardly bear the emotional weight of what comes next in the narrative. Ruth recounts the spring of 1853 with devastating precision. She knew Thomas Hannon was in financial trouble because she overheard conversations between him and his wife. She heard Martha Hannon weeping in her bedroom, worried about losing their home. She watched as Thomas grew increasingly desperate and irritable. Then, one morning in late May, a man arrived at the house. Ruth recognized him as a slave trader from Knoxville, a man with a reputation for cruelty. Thomas brought Samuel out to meet the trader, who examined the boy as one would inspect livestock, checking his teeth, his joints, his overall health. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway, understanding what was about to happen but powerless to prevent it. The sale was completed within hours. The trader paid $500 in cash. Samuel cried and reached for Ruth as the man lifted him onto a wagon. Ruth describes how Miriam collapsed, how her screams echoed through the house, how Thomas Hannon would not meet anyone's eyes. Ruth herself was ordered back to work, forbidden from saying goodbye. That night, she managed to take the small photograph the trader had commissioned of Samuel before the sale. She hid it in her dress and later, using a nail, scratched the inscription on the back. It was the only memorial she could create, the only way to ensure that someone, someday, might know what happened to the boy with the bright smile who deserved so much better than the world gave him. Ruth's testimony continues, describing the years that followed. Miriam never fully recovered from the trauma of Samuel's sale. She died in 1858, Ruth believes from a broken heart as much as from the fever that officially caused her death. Ruth herself survived the Civil War and emancipation, but carried the grief of Samuel's loss for the rest of her long life. She told the interviewer in 1937 that not a single day passed without her thinking about her grandson, wondering where he had been taken, whether he survived, whether he ever thought of her. The testimony ends with Ruth's simple, devastating statement, "I hope the Lord took him home gentle. I hope he knew he was loved." The team sits in silence after reading Ruth's testimony. The archive room feels heavy with the weight of recovered memory. Pastor Thompson wipes his eyes and says quietly that he will arrange for Ruth's testimony to be properly honored in the church's memorial garden. Margaret realizes that they now have the answer to one of their crucial questions. The hidden photograph and its inscription were Ruth's act of resistance, her refusal to let Samuel be erased entirely from history. By concealing the image within the family portrait, she ensured that the truth of the Hannon family's prosperity would be preserved, even if hidden, for future generations to discover. But significant questions remain. What happened to Samuel after he was sold to Dawson and Associates? Dr. Washington has been researching the slave trading firm's records, which are partially preserved at various archives across the South. She reports that Dawson and Associates operated from 1846 to 1863, dealing primarily in the sale of enslaved people from the Upper South to buyers in the Deep South states where cotton and sugar plantations created constant demand for labor. The firm's surviving ledgers, while incomplete, might contain information about Samuel's subsequent sale to Dr. Washington travels to the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, where some of the Dawson and Associates records are housed. She spends 3 days working through account books, correspondence, and bills of sale. The records are fragmentary and often maddeningly vague, using only first names, approximate ages, and general descriptions. But she finds what she believes is Samuel's trail. In July 1853, Dawson and Associates sold a Negro boy, age 7, named Sam, to a cotton planter in Mississippi named Edmund Cartwright for $700. The trader had doubled his profit in less than a month. The cruelty of the commercial logic is staggering. With this new lead, Dr. Washington contacts colleagues at universities in Mississippi who might have access to Cartwright plantation records. This begins another phase of research, reaching deeper into the documentary evidence of slavery's vast machinery of exploitation and suffering. Meanwhile, back in Asheville, the museum team must make decisions about how to present what they have discovered. The original plan for an exhibition celebrating Appalachian prosperity is obviously no longer appropriate. Dr. Callahan proposes instead an exhibition that confronts the complicated truth about wealth, memory, and the legacy of slavery in the region. The centerpiece will be both photographs, the prosperous family and the hidden child, displayed together with Ruth's testimony and the historical documentation the team has assembled. Margaret works with the museum's exhibition designer to create a space that honors the emotional and ethical complexity of the story. They decide against sensationalism or simplified narratives. Instead, the exhibition will invite viewers to sit with difficult truths, to understand how families like the Hannons constructed prosperity through violence, and how that violence continues to echo through generations. They will include contemporary context about ongoing racial inequality, about the ways history shapes present circumstances, about the importance of confronting rather than concealing the past. The exhibition is titled Hidden Truths: Samuel's Story and the Cost of Prosperity. As preparations advance, Margaret contacts Eleanor Hannon Pierce, the elderly woman who donated the family materials to the museum. Eleanor is 93 years old, living in a care facility in Charleston. When Margaret explains what they have discovered, there is a long silence on the phone. Then Eleanor says something that stuns Margaret. She knew about Samuel. Her grandmother, Thomas Hannon's daughter who appears as a child in the photograph, told her the story when Eleanor was young. The grandmother carried guilt about her family's wealth for her entire life, understanding that her education, her comfortable childhood, her social advantages all flowed from that terrible transaction. She made Eleanor promise to eventually donate the family materials to a museum, hoping that someday the truth would come to light. Eleanor explains that her grandmother specifically concealed the photograph of Samuel inside the family portrait, replacing Ruth's original hiding place with a more deliberate preservation strategy. She wanted future generations to find it, to understand the moral foundation of the family's success. Eleanor herself has lived with this knowledge for decades, unsure how to address it. She is relieved that the museum is taking the responsibility seriously, treating Samuel's story with dignity rather than simply discarding it as an embarrassing historical footnote. She asks if she can contribute to the exhibition in some way, perhaps by recording her own testimony about carrying this family history. Margaret arranges for a videographer to visit Eleanor in Charleston. The resulting interview is powerful and raw. Eleanor speaks about the psychological burden of inherited guilt, about the complexity of loving family members while acknowledging their participation in profound evil, about the ongoing effects of slavery on American society. She talks about her own efforts to support civil rights causes, her donations to organizations working for racial justice, her attempts to make some form of amends for wealth built on human suffering. She is clear-eyed about the limitations of these efforts. Nothing can undo what was done to Samuel, to Ruth, to Miriam, but she hopes that telling the truth might contribute, in some small way, to a broader reckoning with history. 3 weeks before the exhibition opens, Dr. Washington makes a breakthrough. Working with a historian at Mississippi State University, she locates plantation records from the Cartwright estate covering the years 1853 to 1865. The records include a registry of enslaved people living on the property, organized by family groups and work assignments. In the 1854 registry, she finds an entry that makes her heart race. Sam, male, age 8, assigned to house service, previously owned by Dawson. This is almost certainly Samuel. The Cartwright plantation was a massive cotton operation with more than 200 enslaved people. Samuel was brought there as a young child and put to work in the main house. The Cartwright records are unusually detailed, including medical notes, disciplinary records, and annual assessments. Dr. Washington finds references to Sam throughout the 1850s. In 1856, there is a note that he was punished for attempting to run away. In 1858, he is listed as having scarlet fever but recovering. In 1860, his name appears in a different section of the records, indicating he had been moved from house service to field work, a reassignment that typically came as punishment or as boys grew older and stronger. Each notation is brief, bureaucratic, reducing a human life to administrative details. But they prove that Samuel survived, at least through the early years of the Civil War. The trail becomes more difficult to follow after 1862. The Cartwright plantation records become sporadic as the war disrupts record-keeping. Edmund Cartwright died in 1863, and his estate fell into chaos. By 1865, when Union forces occupied the region and emancipation became reality, the plantation was abandoned, the enslaved population scattered. Dr. Washington searches Freedmen's Bureau records, post-war census data, and church registries, hoping to find Samuel's name among the thousands of formerly enslaved people beginning new lives in freedom. She finds several men named Samuel or Sam of approximately the right age, but without definitive proof of identity, she cannot say with certainty which, if any, might be Ruth's grandson. However, Dr. Washington discovers something extraordinary in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau School established near the former Cartwright plantation in 1866. Among the enrollment lists, she finds a 17-year-old student named Samuel Johnson. The surname is significant. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people took the names of their mothers or grandmothers, reclaiming family connections that slavery had attempted to sever. Johnson was Ruth's surname in her later life. The timing and age align perfectly. If this is Ruth's grandson, he survived the war and immediately sought education, one of the primary aspirations of newly freed people throughout the South. The school records provide a few additional details. Samuel Johnson attended the school for 2 years, learning to read and write. In 1868, he is listed as employed as a carpenter's apprentice in a nearby town. After that, the documentary trail goes cold again. Dr. Washington exhausts every available resource but cannot find definitive evidence of Samuel's life after 1868. He would have been approximately 22 years old, newly literate, learning a trade, building a life in freedom. Whether he lived a long life, whether he married and had children, whether he ever learned about Ruth's fate or attempted to find his way back to North Carolina, these questions remain unanswered. But the evidence strongly suggests he survived slavery, survived the war, and made the transition to freedom. For Ruth's story, this represents a form of redemption, however partial and incomplete. Margaret shares this discovery with Pastor Thompson and the team at the AME Church. Together, they make a decision. The exhibition will include both the tragedy of Samuel's sale and the hopeful evidence of his survival and pursuit of education. They will be honest about the limitations of the historical record, acknowledging what they know and what remains uncertain. They will honor Ruth's act of preservation, recognizing her as a historian in her own right, someone who understood the importance of documenting truth even when that truth was painful and dangerous to record. The exhibition will position Samuel not merely as a victim but as a survivor whose story connects to broader themes of resilience, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for justice. The museum works with a local sculptor, a Black woman named Andrea Matthews, to create a memorial piece for the exhibition. Andrea proposes a sculpture based on Ruth's description of teaching Samuel about plants in the forest. The piece shows an elderly woman's hands, Ruth's hands, cradling seedlings, while in the background, barely visible, a young boy's figure reaches toward the light. The sculpture is titled "What We Carry Forward," representing both the burden of historical trauma and the seeds of hope and resistance that survive through generations. Andrea includes soil from the site of the former Hannon property and the AME church grounds, literally incorporating the physical landscape that witnessed these events into the artistic memorial. As the exhibition opening approaches, the museum organizes a series of community conversations about slavery in Appalachia, the legacy of racial violence, and the importance of confronting difficult history. The events draw large crowds, including members of the local Black community who share their own family stories, descendants of white families who struggle with their ancestors' participation in slavery, educators seeking resources for teaching this history, and activists working on contemporary racial justice issues. The conversations are sometimes uncomfortable, often emotional, but consistently valuable. People express gratitude that the museum is taking these issues seriously rather than offering sanitized or celebratory narratives of the past. Dr. Baldwin facilitates one session focused specifically on what he calls historical repair, the work of acknowledging harm, understanding its ongoing effects, and taking concrete steps toward justice. He emphasizes that uncovering truth is necessary but not sufficient. The museum must think carefully about how the story is told, who is centered in the narrative, and what actions the institution takes beyond simply displaying historical materials. The museum responds by establishing a partnership with the AME Church and local Black heritage organizations, committing resources to support ongoing research into African American history in the region and creating paid internship opportunities for students from historically Black colleges and universities. Eleanor Hannon Pierce travels to Asheville for the exhibition opening, defying her doctor's advice given her age and fragile health. She insists on being present, saying she owes it to Samuel, to Ruth, to everyone harmed by her family's choices. Margaret accompanies her through the exhibition before the public opening. Eleanor stands for a long time before the two photographs displayed side by side, the prosperous family and the hidden child. She studies Samuel's face, and tears run down her weathered cheeks. She tells Margaret that her grandmother described Samuel's eyes exactly this way, full of intelligence and spirit that slavery could not extinguish. Seeing the photograph finally, after a lifetime of carrying the story, Eleanor says she feels both the weight of historical truth and a strange sense of relief that the secret is finally shared, the burden no longer carried alone. The exhibition opens to the public on a clear autumn morning, exactly 171 years after the photograph of the Hannon family was taken. The museum is filled with people, scholars and students, community members and tourists, journalists and activists. Pastor Thompson leads a blessing ceremony, invoking the memory of Ruth, Samuel, Miriam, and all those whose suffering built the wealth celebrated in so many historical narratives. He reads aloud sections of Ruth's testimony, her voice channeled through his, reaching across generations. The room is silent except for occasional muffled sobs as the emotional reality of the story settles over the crowd. Margaret watches the visitors move through the exhibition, observing their reactions. She sees people lean close to study Samuel's photograph, reading the transcribed inscription. She sees them pause before Andrea's sculpture, contemplating the symbolism of hands and seedlings. She sees them read the historical documentation, the bills of sale and tax records and newspaper advertisements that reduce human beings to commercial transactions. Some visitors move quickly through the space, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity. Others sit on the benches provided and stay for hours, processing what they have learned. Teachers bring students and facilitate discussions. Families read the materials together and talk about how to understand this history. The exhibition receives significant media attention. National newspapers send reporters. Documentary filmmakers request permission to film. Academic journals publish analyses of the museum's approach to presenting difficult history. The response is overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising the museum's ethical seriousness and emotional honesty. However, there is also backlash. Some visitors complain that the museum is promoting a divisive narrative, that it is unfairly judging historical figures by contemporary moral standards, that focusing on slavery obscures other aspects of Appalachian history. The museum receives angry letters and hostile phone calls. Dr. Callahan and his staff address these complaints calmly but firmly, explaining that historical accuracy requires acknowledging all aspects of the past, including aspects that make people uncomfortable. Margaret continues researching Samuel's story even after the exhibition opens. She has become personally invested in a way that transcends professional obligation. She joins genealogical databases and historical societies, networking with researchers across the South who might have information about Samuel Johnson and his potential descendants. She corresponds with elderly residents of the Mississippi county where the Cartwright plantation was located, asking if anyone remembers family stories about ancestors who survived slavery there. The work is slow and often frustrating, filled with dead ends and uncertain leads. But Margaret persists, driven by a sense that Samuel deserves to have his full story told, that his survival and life beyond slavery matter as much as the trauma of his sale. 6 months after the exhibition opens, Margaret receives an email that changes everything. A woman named Denise Johnson, living in Chicago, has seen news coverage of the exhibition. She explains that her great-great-grandfather was named Samuel Johnson, born approximately 1846, who family oral history says was sold as a child from North Carolina to Mississippi and later returned to North Carolina after the Civil War to search for family. He never found them, but he eventually settled in Tennessee, married, and had 7 children. Denise has been researching her family history for years and has documents and photographs spanning several generations. She believes her ancestor might be Ruth's grandson. Margaret's hands shake as she reads the email. She immediately contacts Dr. Washington and Dr. Baldwin, and together they arrange to meet with Denise and review her materials. The meeting takes place at the museum on a cold February morning. Denise brings a large box of family documents, including a Bible with handwritten family records, photographs dating back to the 1880s, and a journal her great-great-grandfather kept late in his life. Margaret carefully examines the Bible first. The family record lists Samuel Johnson, born 1846 in North Carolina, died 1923 in Knoxville, Tennessee. The dates align perfectly with what they know about Ruth's grandson. The journal is the most compelling evidence. Written in an uncertain hand but with moving eloquence, it contains Samuel Johnson's reflections on his life, recorded when he was in his 70s. He describes being sold as a child, the terror of separation, the years of slavery in Mississippi. He writes about learning to read after emancipation, about working as a carpenter, about returning to North Carolina in the 1870s to search for his grandmother Ruth and his mother Miriam. He found the Hannon property abandoned, the family having moved away after Thomas's death. He searched in Asheville and was told that an elderly black woman named Ruth had lived there but had died several years earlier. The grief of missing her by so little time haunted him the rest of his life. Samuel's journal describes his eventual decision to settle in Tennessee, to build a life rather than endlessly searching for a past he could not recover. He married a woman named Clara, a formerly enslaved person who shared his commitment to education and faith. They had 7 children, all of whom learned to read and write, several of whom became teachers themselves. Samuel worked as a carpenter and a community organizer, helping to establish an AME church in his neighborhood. He lived to see his grandchildren and died surrounded by family who honored his memory and continued his legacy. The journal's final entry, written shortly before his death, expresses gratitude for survival, for family, for freedom, and hope that someday the full truth of what enslaved people endured and overcame would be widely known. The museum team works with Denise to verify the connection through historical records and, eventually, through DNA analysis of Ruth's descendants identified through church records and Samuel's descendants through Denise's family line. The genetic evidence confirms what the documentary evidence strongly suggested: they are related. Ruth's grandson Samuel survived, built a life, created a family, and his descendants have carried forward the legacy of resilience and resistance that Ruth embodied when she hid that photograph and scratched her desperate message on the back. Margaret feels as though a circle has been completed, as though Ruth's act of historical preservation across more than a century and a half has finally achieved its full purpose. The museum creates an addendum to the exhibition, incorporating Samuel's journal, Denise's family photographs, and the story of his life after slavery. The narrative no longer ends with the tragedy of a child sold away from his family. Instead, it extends forward to show survival, recovery, the creation of new family bonds, and the persistence of memory across generations. Denise becomes involved with the museum, contributing to educational programs and speaking at events about her family's history and the importance of confronting slavery's legacy honestly. She brings her own children and grandchildren to see the exhibition, showing them the photograph of their ancestor and explaining how his story connects to their lives today. The revised exhibition includes a wall where visitors can leave reflections on what they have learned and how they commit to carrying this history forward. The wall fills quickly with messages expressing grief, guilt, anger, determination, and hope. Some visitors share their own family histories of slavery, sharecropping, segregation, and resistance. Others express commitment to anti-racist work in their own communities. Teachers describe how they will incorporate this history into their classrooms. The wall becomes a powerful testimony to the ongoing relevance of historical reckoning, a space where past and present converge in conversations about justice, memory, and change. Margaret stands before the photographs on the exhibition's one-year anniversary. The prosperous Hannon family in their fine clothing on their brick house porch. The hidden child Samuel, whose sale financed that prosperity. And now, newly added, a photograph from Samuel's later life, showing him as an elderly man surrounded by his children and grandchildren, his face bearing both the marks of hardship and unmistakable dignity. 3 photographs, 3 moments in time, connected by threads of violence and survival, of historical erasure and historical recovery, of trauma and resilience. Margaret thinks about Ruth, who could not have imagined that her simple act of hiding a photograph and scratching a message on metal would eventually lead to this. A full telling of Samuel's story, recognition of the family's complicity and the enslaved people's resistance, a reckoning with the past that might contribute to a more just future. The museum has received requests from institutions across the country wanting to host the exhibition. Margaret and the team are developing a traveling version that will bring Samuel's story to broader audiences. They are also working on a documentary film, a curriculum for schools, and a book that will provide even deeper historical context and analysis. The work continues, expanding outward in ways they never anticipated when Margaret first discovered that hidden photograph and recognized that something was not quite right about a seemingly simple image of prosperity. That on this anniversary evening, after the museum has closed to the public, a small gathering convenes in the exhibition space. Pastor Thompson is there, along with Eleanor Hannon Pierce and Denise Johnson. Dr. Baldwin, Dr. Washington, Patricia, David, and Margaret join them. They stand together before the photographs, representing different relationships to this history. Descendants of the enslaved, descendants of enslavers, researchers, custodians of memory. Pastor Thompson offers a prayer that acknowledges the complexity of their connections, the ways their lives and histories are inextricably entangled, the shared responsibility they bear for confronting truth and pursuing justice. Denise reads aloud from Samuel's journal, her ancestors' words resonating in the quiet room. Eleanor speaks about her family's burden and her commitment to making amends. They light candles, one for Ruth, one for Miriam, one for Samuel, one for all those whose names have been lost but whose lives and resistance deserve to be honored. As the candles flicker in the darkening room, Margaret reflects on what this year of work has taught her. She has learned that historical truth is always more complex than simple narratives of progress or celebration suggest. She has learned that photographs, like all documents, contain layers of meaning that must be carefully excavated. She has learned that the work of historical justice requires not just recovering facts but honoring the humanity of those whose lives were devalued and erased. She has learned that the past is not past, that the choices made by Thomas Hannon in 1853 continue to reverberate through generations, shaping life chances and opportunities in ways both obvious and subtle. And she has learned that confronting this history, as painful as it is, opens possibilities for connection, understanding, and change that would be impossible if the truth remained hidden. The Hannon family photograph no longer appears to be a simple symbol of prosperity. It is revealed as a complex document of moral choice, of violence concealed beneath respectability, of wealth built on suffering. But it is also, thanks to Ruth's courage and foresight, a document of resistance, a testimony to the insistence that truth will not remain hidden forever, that those who were commodified and dehumanized will be remembered as the full human beings they always were. Samuel's eyes, staring out from that hidden daguerreotype, no longer look only into a past of trauma. They look forward to this moment, to the recognition and telling of his story, to the acknowledgement that his life mattered then and matters now. The photograph that seemed to celebrate prosperity becomes instead a call to reckoning, an invitation to understand history not as a collection of settled facts but as an ongoing conversation about justice, memory, and the kind of future we want to create together. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.